The morning air carried the scent of wood smoke and wet earth as Clara Whitmore stepped onto the porch of her small cabin, the boards creaking beneath her worn boots. Spring had come late to the Dakota Territory that year of 1887, and the last patches of snow still clung to the shadows beneath the pine trees that bordered her homestead. She pulled her woolen shawl tighter around her shoulders and surveyed the valley below, where the settlement of Milford spread like scattered seeds across the prairie floor. 6 months had passed since she'd arrived in this place, carrying nothing but a carpetbag and the deed to 40 acres that her late husband had won in a poker game before consumption took him. The townspeople had welcomed her with cautious kindness, the sort offered to a widow woman trying to make her way alone on the frontier. But Clara had proven herself capable enough, clearing land, planting a kitchen garden, and taking in washing to earn her keep through the harsh winter months. This morning felt different, though. Something in the quality of light, perhaps, or the way the wind moved through the new grass. Clara couldn't shake the feeling that change was coming, the way animals sense a storm before the first clouds gather. She was hanging sheets on the line behind her cabin when she saw the girl. The young woman emerged from the tree line like a ghost, her pale dress torn and muddy, her dark hair hanging in tangles around a face streaked with dirt and what looked suspiciously like dried blood. She moved with the careful, measured steps of someone who'd learned that sudden movements could bring unwanted attention. Clara dropped the wet sheet back into her basket and took a step forward. "Girl, are you hurt?" The girl stopped, her dark eyes wide with terror. She opened her mouth as if to speak, but no sound emerged. Instead, she pressed her lips together and shook her head violently, backing toward the trees. "Wait," Clara called softly, the way she might gentle a spooked horse. "I ain't gonna hurt you. You look like you could use some help." The girl hesitated, torn between flight and some desperate need that kept her rooted to the spot. Clara could see her trembling from 30 feet away. Slowly, she knelt and pulled a biscuit from her apron pocket, left over from her breakfast. She set it on the ground between them. "You hungry?" The girl's eyes fixed on the food with the intensity of someone who hadn't eaten in days. After a long moment, she crept forward, grabbed the biscuit, and retreated to what she clearly considered a safe distance. She devoured it in 3 bites, never taking her eyes off Clara. "What's your name?" Clara asked gently. The girl pointed to herself, then shook her head. Her mouth opened and closed several times, but again, no sound came. Clara felt her heart clench with understanding. "Can't speak, can you? That's all right, honey. We'll figure something else out." She moved slowly to the cabin and returned with a slate and chalk she used for keeping household accounts. Setting them on the ground, she backed away. The girl approached cautiously, picked up the chalk, and after a moment's hesitation, began to write. The letters were shaky but readable. "Ruby." "Ruby," Clara repeated. "That's a pretty name. I'm Clara." She pointed to herself. "Can you tell me where you come from?" Ruby wiped the slate clean and wrote again, her small face creased with concentration. "Don't know." "Don't know," Clara murmured. "Well, that's all right. Can you tell me what happened to you? How you got hurt?" Ruby's hand trembled as she gripped the chalk. She glanced around nervously, as if afraid someone might be watching from the trees. Finally, she wrote, "Bad men." Clara's blood chilled. She'd heard stories, of course. The frontier was full of men who preyed on the vulnerable, outlaws who wouldn't hesitate to harm a young woman if it served their purposes. She looked more carefully at Ruby's torn dress, at the bruises on her thin arms, and felt a familiar anger begin to burn in her chest. "How many bad men?" she asked quietly. Ruby held up 3 fingers. "They hurt you." A nod. "They still out there?" Ruby's eyes grew wide with terror. She wrote frantically, "Coming here." Clara felt the world shift beneath her feet. "Coming here? To Milford?" Another nod. Ruby grabbed the slate and wrote with desperate urgency, "Kill everyone." The words hit Clara like a physical blow. She stared at the girl's frightened face, at the absolute certainty in her dark eyes, and knew with cold dread that Ruby was telling the truth. Whatever this girl had witnessed, wherever she'd come from, she was trying to warn them about something terrible. "When?" Clara asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Ruby held up both hands, then closed them into fists, then opened them again. 10. She repeated the gesture. 20. 20 days. Ruby shook her head and pointed to the sun, then made a sweeping motion across the sky. 20 hours. Clara's heart began to race. "They're coming in 20 hours? A nod so vigorous it made Ruby's tangled hair bounce. Clara's mind raced. If outlaws were planning to attack Milford, the settlement would be defenseless. There were maybe 40 souls in the town proper, including women and children. The nearest military post was 3 days' hard ride. They had a sheriff, Tom Brennan, but he was one man with a deputy who was barely 18 and green as spring grass. She knelt to Ruby's level. "Honey, I need you to tell me everything you can about these bad men. Can you do that?" Ruby nodded and began writing again, pausing frequently to wipe tears from her eyes. Slowly, a horrifying picture emerged. 3 men, heavily armed, who'd been moving from settlement to settlement across the territory. They'd hit Ruby's town, a place called Cedar Falls, 2 days ago. They'd killed the sheriff, robbed the bank, and burned half the buildings before riding out. Ruby had hidden in the church basement and seen everything. "How do you know they're coming here?" Clara asked. Ruby wrote, "Heard them talk. Milford next. Bank has gold." Clara's blood turned to ice. The Milford Cattlemen's Bank did indeed have gold, payroll for the railroad crews working to extend the line through the territory. It had arrived just last week under heavy guard, but that guard had moved on, assuming the remote location would be security enough. "Ruby," she said urgently, "I need to get you someplace safe, and then I need to warn the town. Can you walk a little farther?" The girl nodded, though Clara could see exhaustion in every line of her small body. She helped Ruby to her feet and led her toward the cabin. Inside, she quickly gathered supplies: food, water, a clean dress that would be too big but better than the torn thing Ruby wore. "I'm taking you to Mrs. Patterson," Clara explained as she worked. "She's the preacher's wife, got a kind heart and a way with young ones. You'll be safe there while I talk to the sheriff." Ruby grabbed Clara's sleeve and shook her head frantically. She reached for the slate. "Don't believe you." "The sheriff won't believe me?" Clara asked. "Why not?" Ruby's face crumpled with frustrated tears. She wrote, "Nobody believe mute girl." The simple words broke Clara's heart. How many times had this girl tried to communicate something important, only to be dismissed or ignored? How many adults had looked at her disability and assumed she had nothing worthwhile to say? "I believe you," Clara said firmly. "And I'll make sure others do too. But I need you to trust me, Ruby. Can you do that?" The girl studied Clara's face for a long moment, searching for something. Whatever she found there seemed to satisfy her, because she nodded. Clara gathered her courage and her wits. She'd faced hard times before, losing her husband, starting over alone in a strange place, surviving a brutal winter with barely enough food. But this was different. This wasn't just about her own survival. If Ruby was right, 40 innocent people were about to face a massacre unless someone acted. She helped Ruby change into the clean dress and braided her hair as best she could. The girl submitted to the ministrations with the patience of someone accustomed to being cared for by strangers. As Clara worked, she found herself studying Ruby's face, noting the intelligence in her dark eyes, the way she observed everything around her with careful attention. "You're a brave girl," Clara murmured as she tied off the braid. "Traveling all this way to warn folks you don't even know. That takes real courage." Ruby ducked her head, but Clara caught the small smile that tugged at the corner of her mouth. They set out for town as the sun climbed higher, Clara's mind working furiously as they walked. She needed to convince Sheriff Brennan to take Ruby's warning seriously, but she also needed to think about practical preparations. If 3 armed men were coming to rob the bank and terrorize the town, what could 40 civilians do to stop them? The settlement of Milford consisted of a main street lined with wooden buildings, the bank, general store, saloon, church, and a handful of other businesses. Houses spread out from there in no particular pattern, wherever folks had claimed their lots. It was a typical frontier town, built for convenience rather than defense. Clara stopped first at the parsonage, where Margaret Patterson welcomed them with the warm concern that had made her beloved in the community. She was a round-faced woman in her 40s with graying hair and hands perpetually stained with ink from her husband's sermon writing. "Why, Clara Whitmore, what brings you to town so early?" Margaret's eyes fixed on Ruby, taking in her obvious distress. "And who's this little one?" "This is Ruby," Clara said carefully. "She's had some trouble, needs a safe place to stay for a bit." "I was hoping." "Of course," Margaret said immediately. "Come in, girl. You look like you could use a good meal and a bath." Ruby clung to Clara's hand, reluctant to be separated from the one person who'd believed her story. Clara knelt beside her. "I have to go talk to the sheriff now," she explained. "But I'll be back, I promise. Mrs. Patterson will take good care of you." Ruby nodded reluctantly and allowed herself to be led inside. Clara caught Margaret's eye. "She can't speak," Clara said quietly. "But she's been through something terrible. Be patient with her." "Poor little lamb," Margaret murmured. "Don't you worry, Clara. She'll be safe here." Clara hoped that would prove true. She made her way down the dusty main street toward the sheriff's office, rehearsing what she would say. Tom Brennan was a good man, fair and honest, but he was also practical to a fault. Convincing him to take seriously the warnings of a mute girl he'd never met would not be easy. The sheriff's office occupied the ground floor of a 2-story building that also housed the town's small jail. Clara found Brennan at his desk, working through a stack of territorial papers. He was a man in his 50s, with gray threading through his brown hair and the weathered face of someone who'd spent most of his life outdoors. "Morning, Clara," he said, looking up with a smile. "What brings you to town?" "Tom, I need to talk to you about something important. Something dangerous." The smile faded from his face. "What kind of dangerous?" Clara took a deep breath and told him everything. Ruby's arrival, her story about Cedar Falls, her warning about the attack on Milford. She watched Brennan's expression shift from concern to skepticism as she spoke. "Let me get this straight," he said when she finished. A mute girl you've never seen before wandered out of the woods and told you, somehow, that 3 outlaws are coming to attack our town tonight? Tomorrow, Clara corrected. And she didn't tell me, she wrote it down. She can write, Tom. And she's terrified. You should see her eyes. She saw something terrible happen. Brennan leaned back in his chair, clearly torn between his respect for Clara and his doubt about her story. Clara, you're a sensible woman, but think about what you're asking me to believe. How would this girl know the outlaws' plans? How did she travel however many miles to get here? And why would 3 men telegraph their intentions to attack a bank? She was hiding when they talked about it, Clara said desperately. She heard them planning. Tom, what if she's right? What if you ignore this and people die? And what if she's wrong? Brennan countered. What if she's just a traumatized girl with an overactive imagination? You want me to panic the whole town based on the word of someone who can't even speak? Clara felt her temper flare. Her being mute doesn't make her stupid or unreliable. She's trying to save lives, and you're too pig-headed to listen. Brennan's face hardened. Now, Clara, I know you've got a soft heart for strays, but don't you dare, Clara snapped, rising from her chair. Don't you dare dismiss this because you think I'm some soft-hearted woman who can't tell the difference between charity and common sense. That girl risked her life to get here and warn us. The least you can do is investigate. Investigate what? Brennan spread his hands. Even if I believed her story, what am I supposed to do? Ride out and look for 3 mysterious outlaws somewhere in the territory? Alert the territorial marshal based on the testimony of a girl who might not even be telling the truth. Clara stared at him, seeing the frustration and genuine concern in his face, but also the stubborn refusal to act on what he clearly considered insufficient evidence. She understood his position, even as it infuriated her. He was responsible for the town's safety, and panic could be as dangerous as any outlaw. Then don't panic anyone, she said finally. But at least talk to her. See for yourself what she has to say. Brennan hesitated, then nodded slowly. All right. I'll talk to the girl. But Clara, if this turns out to be nothing. If it turns out to be nothing, I'll apologize personally to every person in this town, Clara said. But Tom, if it turns out to be something, and we're not ready. She didn't finish the sentence. She didn't need to. They both knew what happened to unprepared settlements when violent men came calling. As they walked toward the parsonage, Clara found herself praying, something she hadn't done much since her husband died. She prayed that Ruby was wrong, that no danger was coming to Milford. But more than that, she prayed that if danger was coming, they would have the wisdom and courage to face it. The spring morning suddenly felt much colder. Sheriff Brennan's skepticism began to crack the moment he saw Ruby's face. The girl sat at Margaret Patterson's kitchen table, clean now but still bearing the unmistakable marks of someone who'd endured horrors no young person should witness. Her dark eyes tracked every movement in the room with a hypervigilance of prey that knows predators still hunt nearby. When Brennan entered, she pressed herself against Clara's side like a frightened animal seeking shelter. "This is Ruby," Clara said gently. "Ruby, this is Sheriff Brennan. He needs to hear what you told me." Margaret set the slate and chalk before Ruby, along with a plate of warm cornbread that the girl ignored despite her obvious hunger. Her small hands trembled as she picked up the chalk, and Clara noticed how she kept glancing toward the windows, as if expecting armed men to appear at any moment. Brennan pulled up a chair, his weathered face softening as he took in Ruby's condition. "Hello there, little miss. Mrs. Whitmore tells me you've got something important to share." Ruby wrote slowly, her letters more careful now under the sheriff's scrutiny. "3 bad men coming tomorrow." "3 men," Brennan repeated. "Can you tell me what they look like?" Ruby wiped the slate clean and began drawing with surprising skill. First, a tall figure with what appeared to be a long coat. Then a shorter, stockier man with something covering half his face. Finally, a thin figure with an oversized hat. Beneath each sketch, she added details. Tall one has gold tooth. Scar man missing eye. Thin one limps. Clara watched Brennan's expression change as he studied the drawings. "These are very detailed descriptions, Ruby. You got a good look at these men." The girl nodded vigorously, then wrote, "Hid in church cellar. Saw everything." "What did you see?" Brennan asked, his voice gentler now. Ruby's face went pale, but she began writing with determined strokes. The story that emerged made Clara's blood run cold. The 3 men had ridden into Cedar Falls at dawn 2 days ago, when most folks were still abed. They'd shot the sheriff in the street without warning, then systematically robbed every business in town. When some of the men tried to organize resistance, the outlaws had set fire to the grain elevator and threatened to burn the whole settlement unless everyone stayed inside. They killed Mr. Jensen when he tried to stop them, Ruby wrote, tears starting to flow again. "He had a little baby." "Good Lord," Margaret whispered, reading over Brennan's shoulder. "That poor family." Ruby continued writing, her small hand moving with urgent purpose. She'd remained hidden in the church basement throughout the attack, listening to the men talk as they divided their spoils. That's when she'd heard them discussing their next target. "Said Milford Bank has railroad gold," she wrote. "Easy pickings. No army. No marshals." Brennan set down the slate, his face grim. "How did you get away from Cedar Falls?" Ruby's account of her escape made Clara want to gather the girl in her arms and never let go. She'd waited until after dark, then slipped out of the church and stolen an old horse from behind the livery stable. She'd ridden most of the night, following the river toward Milford because she'd heard the outlaws mention it was southeast of Cedar Falls. When the horse went lame, she'd continued on foot, sleeping in haystacks and abandoned sodbusters' shacks, driven by the desperate need to warn innocent people about the horror heading their way. "That's a 60-mile journey," Brennan said quietly. "You made that trip alone?" Ruby nodded, then wrote, "Had T.O. warn you?" The simple words hung in the air like a prayer. Clara saw something shift in Brennan's face, the last of his skepticism crumbling before this girl's obvious courage and determination. "Ruby," he said finally, "when exactly did you hear them say they were coming to Milford?" Ruby wrote carefully, "Tonight they said tomorrow at sundown. When bank closes." Clara felt her heart sink. "That's less than 8 hours from now." Brennan stood abruptly, beginning to pace Margaret's small kitchen. "If this is true, and God help us, I'm starting to believe it is, we've got a serious problem. 3 armed men against a town full of farmers and shopkeepers. Most of our able-bodied men are out working their claims or driving cattle to market. How many men do we have who can handle a gun?" Clara asked. "Maybe a dozen who've seen real fighting," Brennan replied grimly. "Jake Morrison served in the war between the states, and so did old Pete Hutchins. Doc Brennan, no relation, was an army surgeon, but he can shoot straight enough. Then there's my deputy Billy, though he's green as grass and likely to shoot his own foot. Margaret wrung her hands in her apron. What about getting help? Could we send riders to the territorial capital? 3 days hard riding, and that's if the weather holds, Brennan said. They'd arrive to find whatever's left of us. Ruby had been writing frantically during their conversation. Now she held up the slate. Can help. The adults stared at her in surprise. Brennan shook his head gently. I appreciate the offer, little miss, but you've done enough. You've warned us, and now it's up to the grown-ups to handle things. Ruby's eyes flashed with frustration. She erased the slate and wrote again, know their tricks. Know how they think. Clara studied the girl's determined face. What do you mean, Ruby? The explanation that followed revealed intelligence that belied Ruby's young years. She'd observed the outlaws carefully during their attack on Cedar Falls, noting their tactics and methods. They always struck at closing time when the bank would have the most cash on hand, but the streets would be relatively empty. They used fear as their primary weapon, making examples of anyone who resisted to cow the rest of the population into submission. They worked fast and brutal, never staying in one place long enough for organized resistance to form. But they make mistakes, Ruby wrote. Tall one drinks too much. Scarman gets angry fast. Thin one scared of horses. Those are useful details, Brennan admitted. But Ruby, this is going to be dangerous. I can't ask a girl to. Ruby cut him off with vigorous writing. Not asking. Telling. My fault if people die. Your fault. Clara said sharply. How is any of this your fault? Ruby's face crumpled with guilt and grief. She wrote slowly. Should have warned Cedar Falls. Scared to come out. Mr. Jensen died because I hid. The raw pain in those words hit Clara like a physical blow. This girl had been carrying the weight of survivors' guilt along with everything else, blaming herself for deaths that no reasonable person would hold her responsible for. Ruby, listen to me, Clara said firmly, kneeling beside the girl's chair. What happened in Cedar Falls was not your fault. You were a girl, alone and frightened, doing what you had to do to survive. No one could have expected you to take on 3 armed men. But Ruby shook her head stubbornly and wrote, could have found help. Could have done something. Margaret had tears in her eyes as she read the words. Poor little lamb. You've been carrying this burden all alone. Brennan cleared his throat. Ruby, Mrs. Whitmore is right. You're not responsible for what those men did. But if you really want to help us prepare for them, I won't turn down any advantage we can get. The girl's face brightened slightly. She began writing again, this time with renewed purpose. Her observations were remarkably detailed and tactically sound. The 3 outlaws always approached a town from the east, using the morning sun at their backs to make it harder for defenders to see them clearly. They relied on shock and overwhelming force in the initial assault, but they weren't particularly clever about sustained fighting. If a town could weather the first 15 minutes of their attack, the outlaws tended to lose confidence and look for easier prey. They always hit bank first, Ruby wrote. Then saloon for whiskey. Then general store for supplies. That's a predictable pattern, Brennan mused. We could use that against them. Clara found herself studying Ruby with new respect. Despite her youth and disability, the girl possessed a keen strategic mind and the kind of observational skills that could mean the difference between life and death in a situation like this. All right, Brennan said decisively. We need to warn the town and start organizing a defense. But we have to be careful about how we do it. If we panic folks, they might scatter, and that'll just make things worse. What do you need us to do? Clara asked. I need you and Mrs. Patterson to quietly spread the word among the women. Tell them to gather the girlren and any elderly folks at the church. It's the most defensible building we have, all stone construction with limited entry points. Don't tell them about the attack directly. Just say there's been some trouble reported in the area and we're taking precautions. Margaret nodded grimly. I'll start with the other church ladies. They can help spread the word without causing a panic. I'll round up the men who can fight, Brennan continued. We'll meet at the grain warehouse at 4 o'clock to plan our defense. That gives us about 3 hours to get organized. Ruby had been writing while they talked. Now she held up the slate. Need lookouts on roads. Smart thinking, Brennan agreed. We'll post men on all the approaches to town. If we can spot them coming, we might be able to set up an ambush. They expect easy fight, Ruby wrote. Surprise them. Clara felt a fierce pride in this remarkable girl who'd endured so much and still thought first of protecting others. What about you, Ruby? Where will you be during all this? The girl's face set in stubborn lines. She wrote, with you. Absolutely not, Clara said immediately. You'll be safe in the church with Mrs. Patterson and the other women and girlren. Ruby shook her head violently and wrote, need to see them coming. Only one who knows their faces. Brennan and Clara exchanged glances. The girl had a point. None of them had ever seen these outlaws, and in the confusion of a fight, being able to identify the enemy could be crucial. She could stay with me in the sheriff's office, Brennan said slowly. Good view of the main street, solid walls, and she'd be protected but still able to help spot them. Ruby nodded eagerly, but Clara felt her stomach clench with worry. The idea of putting this girl anywhere near danger after everything she'd already endured seemed wrong, but she also recognized the practical value of Ruby's knowledge. I don't like it, Clara said finally, but I suppose if she stays in the office with you, and if she promises to get down and stay down the moment shooting starts. I promise, Ruby wrote solemnly. The next few hours passed in a blur of desperate preparation. Clara and Margaret moved through the town like wildfire, spreading the word among the women with careful vagueness that nevertheless conveyed the seriousness of the situation. Mary Henderson gathered her 3 young children without question when told there might be trouble. Sarah Coleman helped organize supplies at the church, asking no questions but clearly understanding that something significant was happening. Old Mrs. Garrett, despite her arthritis, insisted on helping move food and medical supplies to the stone building that would serve as their refuge. Meanwhile, Brennan assembled his makeshift army. Jake Morrison arrived with his old army rifle and the steady demeanor of a man who'd seen combat before. Pete Hutchins brought his hunting rifle and a grim smile that suggested he was looking forward to the fight. Doc Brennan appeared with his medical bag and a surprisingly modern repeating rifle. Young Billy Fletcher, the deputy, showed up pale but determined, his hand never leaving the grip of his pistol. Others came too. Farmers, shopkeepers, even the saloon keeper, who arrived with a shotgun and a leather bag that clinked with spare ammunition. They were far from a professional fighting force, but they were men defending their homes and families, which counted for something. As the afternoon wore on, Clara found herself moving between the church, where the women and children waited with tense patience, and the sheriff's office, where Ruby sat at the window with field glasses, watching the eastern approaches to town. The girl had barely spoken, or written, since their morning planning session, but Clara could see the tension in her small shoulders, the way her hands never quite stopped trembling. "You don't have to do this," Clara told her during one visit. "You've already done more than anyone could ask." Ruby turned from the window long enough to write, "Yes, I do." The simple certainty in those words made Clara's heart ache. This girl had already lost so much, had already seen too much violence and death. The idea that she felt compelled to risk herself again for people she barely knew spoke to a courage that humbled Clara. "Then I'm staying too," Clara said firmly. Ruby looked alarmed and wrote quickly, "Too dangerous." "No more dangerous for me than for you," Clara replied. "And if you're determined to be here, then you'll have someone looking out for you." Brennan looked up from cleaning his rifle. "Clara, you don't need to." "Yes, I do," she interrupted, unconsciously echoing Ruby's words. "That girl risked everything to warn us. The least I can do is make sure she's not alone when the danger comes." As the sun began its descent toward the western horizon, the town of Milford held its breath. The main street, usually bustling with late-day commerce, stood nearly empty. Windows were shuttered, doors barred. The only signs of life were the armed men positioned at strategic points throughout the settlement, and the watchful eyes peering from behind curtains and through cracks in walls. In the sheriff's office, Ruby suddenly stiffened at her window post. She grabbed the slate and wrote with urgent strokes, "Dust Cloud East Road." Clara's heart began to pound as she peered through the field glasses. There, perhaps 2 miles distant, a small cloud of dust rose against the evening sky. As she watched, she could make out 3 dark figures on horseback, riding hard toward Milford. "They're coming," she whispered. Ruby nodded grimly and wrote, "Get ready. They come fast now." The waiting was over. The 3 riders materialized from the dust cloud like demons from a fever dream. Even at distance, Clara could see that Ruby's descriptions had been precise. The tall one in the long coat rode a black stallion with the easy confidence of a man accustomed to taking whatever he wanted. The scarred man on his left hunched forward in his saddle, his missing eye giving his face a lopsided, predatory appearance. The thin one brought up the rear, favoring his left leg even while mounted, his oversized hat casting his features in shadow. Ruby pressed herself against the window frame, her small body rigid with recognition and terror. She wrote on the slate with shaking hands, "Same ones. No mistake." Sheriff Brennan moved to the window beside them, checking his rifle one final time. "They're riding hard," he observed grimly. "They mean to hit us fast and brutal, just like you said." Clara felt her mouth go dry as she watched the outlaws approach. They rode with the purposeful urgency of men who'd done this before, who knew exactly how long they had before resistance could organize. The tall one raised his hand, and the 3 men spread out as they entered the town's outskirts, each taking a different street but all converging on the main commercial district where the bank waited. "Positions, everyone," Brennan called softly out the back door to the men hidden throughout the settlement. The response came as a series of subtle movements, curtains shifting, barrel shadows deepening, the barely audible sound of rifle bolts sliding home. Ruby suddenly grabbed Clara's arm and pointed frantically at the slate. "Tall one going to bank. Others circle back." Clara peered through the field glasses and saw that Ruby was right. The leader had dismounted in front of the Milford Cattleman's Bank, while his companions continued their sweep around the block. It was exactly the pattern Ruby had described. Strike fast at the primary target while the others secured escape routes and watched for trouble. The tall outlaw's gold tooth caught the dying sunlight as he grinned and kicked open the bank's front door. The sound of splintering wood echoed down the empty street like a gunshot. Inside, Clara knew old Samuel Morrison, Jake's younger brother, waited behind the counter with a shotgun and instructions to delay as long as possible while pretending to cooperate. "Easy, Samuel," Brennan murmured, though the banker couldn't possibly hear him. "Just keep him talking." The scarred man had positioned himself across from the saloon, his one good eye scanning the street for signs of resistance. His horse danced nervously beneath him, sensing its rider's tension. Clara could see the man's hand resting on the grip of his pistol, ready to draw at the first sign of trouble. The thin outlaw had disappeared around the corner of the general store, presumably to watch the back streets and ensure no one could approach from behind. Ruby had been right about their tactics. They were efficient and experienced, but also predictable in their efficiency. Ruby wrote urgently, "Tall one drinks when nervous. Scar man shoots first. Thin one runs if surprised." "Good intelligence," Brennan acknowledged. "If we can separate them." His words were cut off by the sound of shouting from inside the bank. The tall outlaw's voice carried clearly in the evening air. "Open that damn safe, or I'll put a bullet in your skull." Samuel's reply was too quiet to hear, but his tone suggested he was playing for time, just as planned. Clara found herself holding her breath, knowing that every second of delay gave the town's defenders more opportunity to position themselves. The scarred outlaw suddenly straightened in his saddle, his head turning toward the church where the women and children waited. Clara's blood chilled as she realized he might have spotted movement there. If he decided to investigate. Ruby saw it too. She wrote frantically, "He sees something. Gets angry when confused." As if summoned by her words, the scarred man began riding toward the church, his hand now openly gripping his pistol. Clara watched in horror as he approached the building where Margaret Patterson was protecting 24 innocent souls. "He's going for the church," Clara whispered. Brennan cursed under his breath. "Jake's supposed to be covering that approach. Where the hell?" A rifle shot cracked across the settlement like thunder. The scarred outlaw's horse reared, screaming, as blood bloomed across the man's shoulder. Jake Morrison stepped out from behind the church's stone wall, already working the bolt of his rifle for a second shot. "Should have stayed in the saddle, you bastard," Jake called out. The wounded outlaw's face contorted with rage. He leveled his pistol at Jake, but before he could fire, Pete Hutchins appeared from the opposite direction, his hunting rifle trained on the mounted man. "Drop it," Pete commanded. "You're covered." The scarred man's head swiveled between the two defenders, calculating odds. For a moment, Clara thought he might surrender. Then his face twisted into a snarl of fury, and he spurred his wounded horse directly at Jake, firing wildly. Jake dove behind the church wall as bullets chipped stone around his head. Pete's rifle boomed, and the scarred outlaw jerked in his saddle but managed to stay mounted. He wheeled his horse and galloped back toward the main street, blood streaming from 2 wounds but still dangerous. The sound of gunfire brought immediate chaos. Inside the bank, the tall outlaw's voice rose to a roar. "What the hell is going on out there?" Ruby wrote quickly, "He panic now. Makes mistakes." The thin outlaw appeared at the corner of the general store, his oversized hat askew as he looked frantically for the source of the shooting. Clara could see his horse shying beneath him, confirming Ruby's observation about his poor horsemanship. "Billy," Brennan called to his deputy, who was positioned across the street. "Take the thin one. Don't let him get away." Young Billy Fletcher stepped into the street, his pistol drawn but his hands shaking visibly. "You there!" he called out, his voice cracking with nerves. "Drop your weapons and surrender." The thin outlaw's response was swift and decisive. He fired 2 quick shots in Billy's direction, sending the young deputy scrambling for cover, then turned his horse to flee. But the animal, already spooked by the gunfire, refused to obey. It reared and danced sideways, nearly throwing its rider. Doc Brennan appeared from his hiding place behind the blacksmith shop, his repeating rifle speaking with methodical precision. The first shot took the thin outlaw's hat clean off his head. The second shattered his rifle stock. The third sent him tumbling from his panicked horse to land hard in the dusty street. "Stay down," Doc called out. "Next one goes through your heart." The thin man raised his hands, blood trickling from a gash on his forehead where he'd struck the ground. One down, Clara thought, but the most dangerous ones were still free. The tall outlaw burst from the bank, a canvas bag in one hand and his pistol in the other. His gold tooth gleamed as he snarled at the scene of chaos around him. "Jeremiah! Court! Where are you, you yellow dogs?" The scarred man, apparently named Jeremiah, came galloping around the corner of the saloon, still bleeding but very much in the fight. He pulled up beside his leader, both men scanning the street for targets. "Ambush," Jeremiah spat. "The whole damn town's ready for us." Ruby had been writing frantically. Now she held up the slate. "They run now or fight to death. Leader chooses." Clara watched the tall outlaw's face as he made his calculation. She could see the moment his greed warred with his survival instinct. The bank bag in his hand represented the railroad payroll they'd come for, but staying to fight meant facing an entire town of defenders. "Burns!" the leader shouted suddenly. "Where's Burns?" They were calling for the thin one, Clara realized, not knowing he was already captured. When no answer came, the tall man's face darkened with understanding and fury. "Those sons of bitches got Tommy," he snarled to Jeremiah. "We're taking our money and burning this whole place down." Ruby wrote urgently, "They set fires when angry. Buildings. People." Clara felt her heart sink. If the outlaws started setting fires, all their careful preparations would mean nothing. A frontier town was nothing but kindling waiting for a match, and innocent people would burn alive in their hiding places. "We have to stop them," she whispered. Brennan nodded grimly. "Signal for the general attack. Everyone move in at once. Don't give them time to start fires." He raised his rifle and fired 3 quick shots into the air, the prearranged signal. Immediately, armed men emerged from their hiding places throughout the settlement. Jake Morrison appeared at the church corner, Pete Hutchins stepped out from behind the grain warehouse, Doc Brennan advanced from the blacksmith shop. Even young Billy Fletcher, despite his earlier panic, moved forward with his pistol drawn. The 2 remaining outlaws found themselves surrounded by a closing circle of determined defenders. The tall man's eyes darted frantically as he counted the rifles pointed in his direction. "You boys picked the wrong town," Jake called out. "Drop your weapons and surrender. You're outnumbered and outgunned." For a moment, Clara thought it might end without more bloodshed. Then the tall outlaw's face split in a savage grin that made her blood run cold. "Maybe so," he called back, "but I can still take some of you with me." He grabbed a bottle from his saddlebag, coal oil, Clara realized with horror, and flung it at the nearest building. The glass shattered against the general store's wooden wall, and he followed it with a lit match from his pocket. Flames whooshed up the dry timber with terrifying speed. "Jeremiah," he shouted. "Fire everything. If we can't have this place, nobody can." The scarred man grinned wickedly and reached for his own bottle of oil. But before he could throw it, Ruby did something that surprised everyone. The girl suddenly bolted from the sheriff's office, running directly into the street toward the two outlaws. She moved with desperate purpose, and Clara's heart nearly stopped as she realized what the girl intended. "Ruby, no!" Clara screamed, rushing after her. But Ruby had already reached the scarred man's horse. With movements quick as a striking snake, she grabbed the animal's bridle and yanked hard to one side. The already wounded and nervous horse reared again, throwing Jeremiah from the saddle. The bottle of coal oil flew from his hand to shatter harmlessly in the dirt. The tall outlaw wheeled his horse toward Ruby, his face contorted with murderous rage. "You little bitch! I'll burn you alive!" Clara reached the girl just as the outlaw raised his pistol. Without thinking, she threw herself between Ruby and the gun, shielding the girl with her own body. The weapon's muzzle looked as big as a cannon bore as it swung toward them. The shot that followed seemed to echo forever in the evening air. But Clara felt no pain, heard no scream from Ruby. Instead, she saw the tall outlaw jerk backward in his saddle, a red stain spreading across his long coat. Sheriff Brennan stepped forward, smoke still rising from his rifle barrel. "Should have taken the surrender when you had the chance," Brennan said quietly. The outlaw leader slumped forward, then toppled from his horse to lie still in the dust. The canvas bag of stolen money spilled its contents across the street, gold coins and paper bills scattered like leaves in the wind. Jeremiah, on the ground with what was clearly a broken arm from his fall, looked around at the circle of armed men and raised his good hand in surrender. "Don't shoot," he gasped. "I yield." It was over. 3 men had ridden into Milford with murder and robbery in their hearts, and now one was dead, one was wounded and captured, and the third sat bound and defeated in the street. The fire at the general store was already being doused by a bucket brigade organized by the women from the church. Clara knelt in the dusty street, holding Ruby close as the girl shook with reaction to everything that had happened. Around them, the people of Milford emerged from their hiding places, faces grim but relieved. "You saved us all," Clara whispered to Ruby. "Your warning, your courage. You saved this whole town." Ruby pulled back enough to look at Clara's face, then reached for her ever-present slate. With shaking hands, she wrote, "We saved each other." And Clara, looking around at the community that had come together to protect itself, knew the girl was absolutely right. The days following the attack passed in a strange mixture of celebration and somber reflection. Milford had survived its trial by fire, but the cost of victory weighed heavily on everyone's minds. The general store bore blackened scars where the outlaws' flames had taken hold, though quick action by the bucket brigade had prevented the fire from spreading. More troubling was the wound young Billy Fletcher had taken in the final moments of the fight, a bullet graze across his ribs that Doc Brennan assured everyone would heal clean, but which served as a stark reminder of how close they'd all come to disaster. Ruby had hardly left Clara's side in the 3 days since the confrontation. The girl seemed to be processing everything she'd experienced, from the trauma of witnessing the massacre at Cedar Falls to her desperate journey across 60 miles of frontier wilderness to the violent climax here in Milford. She wrote less frequently now, as if words, even written ones, felt inadequate to capture the magnitude of what had transpired. Clara found herself watching Ruby with growing concern and deepening affection. The girl had shown remarkable courage, not just in making the journey to warn them, but in her final desperate act that had prevented the outlaws from burning down half the town. But courage extracted a price, and Clara could see that price in the shadows under Ruby's dark eyes, in the way she startled at sudden sounds, in her reluctance to let Clara out of her sight. On the fourth morning after the attack, Clara woke to find Ruby sitting by the cabin window, staring out at the valley where morning mist clung to the grass like ghostly fingers. The girl held her slate in her lap, but it remained blank. She seemed lost in thoughts too deep for a young person to carry alone. "Couldn't sleep?" Clara asked softly, settling into the chair beside her. Ruby shook her head, then picked up her chalk and wrote slowly, "Dreams about Cedar Falls." Clara's heart ached for this girl who'd witnessed such horrors. "The dreams will fade with time," she said gently. "The hurt won't disappear completely, but it'll become something you can carry without it crushing you." Ruby looked at her with those two old eyes and wrote, "How do you know?" The question caught Clara off guard. She realized she'd been speaking from her own experience with loss and trauma, but she'd never shared those experiences with Ruby. "Perhaps it was time. I lost my husband to consumption 2 years ago," Clara said quietly. "Watched him waste away day by day, and there wasn't anything I could do to stop it. For months afterward, I had dreams where I could save him, where I found the right medicine or the right doctor. Then I'd wake up and have to remember all over again that he was gone." Ruby wrote, "Still have dreams?" "Sometimes," Clara admitted. "But they're different now. Gentler. Now I dream about the good times we had together, about his laugh and the way he used to sing while he worked. The pain is still there, but it's not sharp anymore. It's more like the ache you get in a muscle that's been working hard. You notice it, but it doesn't stop you from moving forward." Ruby considered this for a long moment, then wrote, Jensen had good laugh too." "Tell me about him," Clara said. What followed was the longest conversation, if writing on a slate could be called conversation, that Ruby had engaged in since her arrival. Through careful questions and patient waiting, Clara drew out the story of Ruby's life in Cedar Falls. She'd been an orphan, taken in by the town's pastor and his wife when her parents died in a cholera outbreak. The pastor's wife had taught her to read and write, recognizing the intelligence that burned bright behind Ruby's inability to speak. Mr. Jensen, the man who'd died trying to defend the town, had been the blacksmith who'd always had a kind word and sometimes a peppermint stick for the mute girl who helped around the church. "Everyone said I was cursed," Ruby wrote. "Baby born without voice brings bad luck. But pastor's wife said God had different plan for me." "She was right," Clara said firmly. "If you'd had a voice, you might have cried out when those men came to Cedar Falls. You might not have stayed hidden long enough to learn their plans. Your silence saved Milford." Ruby stared at her slate for a long time before writing. "Never thought of it that way." A knock at the cabin door interrupted their conversation. Clara opened it to find Sheriff Brennan standing on her porch, his hat in his hands and an unusual expression of uncertainty on his weathered face. "Morning, Clara." "Ruby," he said, nodding to both of them. "I hope I'm not intruding, but I've got some news I thought you both should hear." "Come in," Clara said, stepping aside. "Coffee's fresh." Brennan accepted a cup gratefully and settled into a chair across from Ruby. "I've been in communication with the Territorial Marshal's office about our situation here. Sent a full report about the attack and the outlaws we captured." Ruby looked up with interest, her chalk poised over the slate. "The good news is that those 3 men were wanted for robberies and murders across half the territory. There's a substantial reward for their capture, $500 each for the two we took alive, and $300 for the dead one, even though he won't be standing trial." Clara nearly spilled her coffee. "That's over $1,000. $1,300 to be exact," Brennan confirmed. "Now, by rights, most of that reward should go to the person who made their capture possible." He looked directly at Ruby. "That would be you, young lady." Ruby's eyes went wide with shock. She wrote frantically, "Too much money." "Maybe so," Brennan agreed, "but you earned it. Your warning saved lives, and your actions during the fight helped end it without more bloodshed." Clara saw opportunity in this unexpected windfall. "Ruby, that's enough money to make a real fresh start somewhere. You could go to a big city, get proper schooling, maybe even find a doctor who could help with your voice." But Ruby was already shaking her head and writing, "Don't want to leave." "You don't have to decide right away," Brennan said gently. "The money will be held in trust at the bank until you're old enough to claim it, or until you decide what you want to do." Ruby set down her chalk and looked back and forth between Clara and the sheriff. When she picked up the chalk again, her writing was careful and deliberate. "Want to stay with Clara. If she wants me." Clara felt her throat tighten with emotion. In the days since Ruby's arrival, she'd grown more attached to the girl than she'd expected. The idea of Ruby leaving, of going back to being alone in her cabin, suddenly seemed unbearable. "Of course I want you to stay," Clara said softly. "If that's what you really want." Ruby nodded emphatically, then wrote, "Family now?" "Family now," Clara confirmed, and felt something that had been broken inside her begin to heal. Brennan cleared his throat, clearly moved by the exchange. "Well, that settles that question. But there's something else we need to discuss. The territorial government wants to send an investigator to talk to Ruby about what she witnessed in Cedar Falls. There might be other members of this gang still out there, and her testimony could be crucial to tracking them down." Ruby's face went pale, but she wrote steadily, "Will help if I can." "The investigator is a woman," Brennan added quickly. "Marshal Sarah Cody. She's experienced with difficult cases and witnesses who've been through trauma. She'll be gentle with you." "When?" Ruby wrote. "Next week, probably. She's riding down from the territorial capital now." Ruby nodded, then wrote something that surprised both adults. "Want to help other towns too." Over the following days, as word of Milford's successful defense spread throughout the territory, the little settlement found itself the center of considerable attention. Newspaper reporters arrived to document the story of the mute girl who'd saved a town. Territorial officials came to study their defensive preparations as a model for other remote communities. Even a photographer made the journey to capture images of the participants in what the papers were calling the Battle of Milford. Ruby endured the attention with patient grace, though Clara could see it wearied her. The girl wrote out her story again and again for various officials, each time reliving the trauma of Cedar Falls and the desperate journey that followed. But she never complained, never refused to cooperate with the investigations that might prevent similar tragedies elsewhere. Marshal Sarah Cody proved to be exactly what Brennan had promised, a competent, compassionate woman in her 40s who put Ruby at ease immediately. She spent 3 days in Milford, conducting thorough interviews not just with Ruby but with everyone who'd participated in the town's defense. Her final report, she told them, would be distributed to law enforcement across the territory as a guide for communities facing similar threats. "You've given us valuable intelligence about outlaw tactics," she told Ruby on her final day in town. "But more than that, You've shown what one person with courage can accomplish." Ruby wrote her response carefully. "One person plus whole town." "Exactly right," Marshall Cody agreed. "Courage is contagious. Your example helped everyone else find their own bravery." As summer deepened and the immediate excitement of the attack faded into memory, life in Milford settled into new rhythms. The railroad payroll that had been the outlaws' target was used to complete the rail line extension, bringing new prosperity to the region. The general store was rebuilt with stone foundations and better fire protection. Young Billy Fletcher, his confidence restored after his wound healed, proved himself an increasingly capable deputy. Clara and Ruby developed their own routines as well. Mornings were for household chores and tending Clara's expanding garden. Ruby proved to have a remarkable gift for growing things. The soil seemed to respond to her patient care in ways that surprised even experienced farmers like Jake Morrison. She had an intuitive understanding of when to plant, when to water, when to harvest. Her small hands could coax life from the most stubborn seeds. Afternoons often found them in town, where Ruby had begun helping Margaret Patterson with the church's literacy program for children. The girl's own struggles with communication had given her unusual patience and creativity in teaching others. She developed a system of pictures and gestures that helped even the youngest children understand difficult concepts. Parents began requesting specifically that Ruby work with their children, recognizing something special in her teaching methods. Evenings were Clara's favorite time, when she and Ruby would sit on the porch watching the sun set over the valley, while Clara read aloud from books ordered specially from back east. Ruby was hungry for learning, soaking up everything from poetry to practical manuals on farming and animal husbandry. Sometimes she would write responses to the stories they read, sharing insights that consistently surprised Clara with their depth and wisdom. It was during one such evening in late August that Ruby brought up a subject she'd been clearly thinking about for some time. The air was warm and still, heavy with the scent of ripening grain from the valley below. Clara had just finished reading a chapter from a novel about a young woman making her way in the world when Ruby reached for her slate. "Been thinking about the money," she wrote. Clara set aside the book. "What about it? Want to use some to help other children like me? Children who can't speak?" Clara asked. Ruby shook her head and wrote, "Children with no family. Children who seen bad things. Children who need safe place." Clara felt her heart swell with pride. Even with a substantial fortune waiting for her, Ruby's first thoughts were for others in need. "That's a beautiful idea. What did you have in mind?" Ruby had clearly been planning this conversation. She wrote quickly, her ideas spilling out onto the slate faster than Clara could read them. She wanted to establish a fund to help orphan children, particularly those who'd been traumatized by violence or abandonment. The money could provide safe homes, education, and medical care for children who might otherwise fall through the cracks of frontier society. "Maybe start here in Milford," Ruby wrote. "Show other towns how to do it. You want to turn Milford into a sanctuary for children in need?" Clara asked. Ruby nodded enthusiastically, then wrote, "We saved each other. Can save others too." Clara looked out over the peaceful valley, imagining it filled with the voices and laughter of children who'd found safety and hope after trauma. It was an ambitious dream, but she'd learned not to underestimate Ruby's determination and wisdom. "It would take more than money," Clara said thoughtfully. "We'd need buildings, teachers, people trained to help children who've been hurt." "Have time to plan," Ruby wrote. "Money grows interest until I'm 18. Clara smiled at the girl's practical thinking. We could start small. Maybe take in 1 or 2 children to begin with, see how it works." "Yes," Ruby wrote, then added, "together." As autumn painted the valley in shades of gold and crimson, the first test of Ruby's vision arrived in the form of 2 young brothers whose parents had been killed in an Indian raid near the territorial border. The boys, ages 8 and 10, arrived in Milford hollow-eyed and silent, having been passed from one reluctant relative to another before finally being sent to the territorial orphanage. Clara had volunteered to take them in temporarily while permanent arrangements were made, but Ruby had other ideas. She worked patiently with the traumatized children, using drawing and written games to help them begin processing their grief. She showed them around the settlement, introduced them to other children, and gradually coaxed them back toward something resembling normal girlhood behavior. The older boy, Samuel, had stopped speaking entirely after witnessing his parents' deaths. Ruby spent hours with him, not trying to force words but simply being present, showing him through her own example that communication could take many forms. She taught him to write simple words, to draw pictures of his feelings, to use his hands to express what his voice couldn't manage. The younger boy, Matthew, had been having violent nightmares that left him screaming and inconsolable. Ruby seemed to understand his terror in ways that surprised the adults. She would sit beside his bed during the worst episodes, her small hand resting gently on his shoulder, her presence somehow calming the demons that chased him through his dreams. By the time the territorial representative arrived to take them to the orphanage, the boys had begun speaking again and showed clear reluctance to leave Milford. Samuel had started helping Ruby in the garden, finding peace in the simple rhythm of planting and tending. Matthew had attached himself to Clara, following her around the cabin and helping with household chores with the desperate eagerness of a girl afraid of being abandoned again. After much discussion with officials and careful evaluation of Clara's circumstances, permission was granted for the boys to remain permanently in her care. The decision was influenced partly by Ruby's reward money, which provided financial security, but mostly by the obvious healing that was taking place in the makeshift family. First success, Ruby wrote that evening as they watched the brothers playing in the yard with a wooden horse Jake Morrison had carved for them. "Just the beginning," Clara agreed. As winter settled over the Dakota Territory, Clara found herself reflecting on the extraordinary changes the past year had brought. She'd begun it as a lonely widow struggling to survive on an isolated homestead. Now she had a daughter in all but legal terms, 2 young boys who called her Ma Clara, and plans that stretched far beyond her own small cabin. Ruby had grown too, not just in size but in confidence and purpose. She still startled at sudden loud noises, still had occasional nightmares about Cedar Falls, but she'd found ways to transform her pain into purpose. Her inability to speak had become, paradoxically, one of her greatest strengths in working with traumatized children. She communicated through patience, through careful observation, through the kind of deep listening that only someone who'd learned to navigate the world without a voice could truly understand. The town had changed as well. The attack had brought people together in ways that prosperity alone never could. Neighbors who'd barely spoken before the crisis now regularly shared meals and helped with each other's work. The church had become a true community center, not just for worship but for planning and mutual support. Even the saloon had transformed, becoming less a place for solitary drinking and more a gathering spot where men discussed community improvement projects. Sheriff Brennan had been right about the territorial attention their successful defense would bring. By Christmas, Milford had received official designation as a model frontier community, with funding for improved roads, a larger school, and eventually a telegraph line that would connect them to the wider world. Ruby's story had been written up in newspapers as far away as Chicago and St. Louis, inspiring other communities to organize their own defenses against outlaw threats. But perhaps the most significant change was in Clara herself. The woman who'd once thought her useful life was over had discovered reserves of strength and purpose she'd never suspected. Taking care of Ruby and the boys had awakened maternal instincts she'd thought buried with her husband's dreams of children they'd never had. She found herself thinking not just about surviving each day but about building something lasting, something that would matter long after she was gone. On Christmas Eve, as snow fell softly outside their expanded cabin, the makeshift family gathered around the fireplace for their evening reading. The two boys flanked Clara on the sofa while Ruby sat cross-legged on the floor, her slate within easy reach. Clara had chosen to read from the Gospel of Luke, the familiar story of hope born in the most unlikely circumstances. When she finished, Ruby wrote on her slate and held it up for everyone to see. "Best Christmas ever." 10-year-old Samuel, the older of the two brothers, looked thoughtful. "Ruby, do you think you'll ever get your voice back?" Ruby considered the question seriously, then wrote, "Don't need voice to speak truth. Don't need words to show love." 8-year-old Matthew nodded solemnly. "You talk plenty loud for us to hear." Clara felt tears prick her eyes as she looked around at the faces illuminated by firelight. Her chosen family, bound not by blood but by something deeper. Ruby had arrived as a messenger of warning about immediate danger, but she'd stayed to become something far more precious, a reminder that even the most broken things could be made whole again, that even the most frightened people could find courage when they had something worth protecting. Outside, the wind howled across the prairie, but inside the cabin, all was warmth and safety. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new children who needed help, new ways to build the sanctuary Ruby had envisioned. But tonight, they were simply a family grateful for the gift of each other's presence. Ruby picked up her slate one final time and wrote words that seemed to capture everything they'd all learned. "Love speaks loudest without words." Clara read the message aloud, and in the silence that followed, she could almost hear the sound of a community healing, of individual lives becoming something larger and more meaningful than any of them could have achieved alone. The mute girl's warning had saved Milford from destruction, but her presence had given them something even more valuable, a vision of what they could become when they chose to protect and nurture each other. As the fire died down to glowing embers and the family prepared for sleep, Clara offered a silent prayer of gratitude for the chain of events that had brought them together. Ruby's inability to speak had been seen by some as a curse, but Clara now understood it as a blessing in disguise. In a world full of noise and empty chatter, sometimes the most important truths could only be heard in silence, communicated through actions rather than words, written on the heart rather than spoken aloud. The attack on Milford had lasted less than an hour, but its aftermath would shape the community for generations to come. And at the center of that transformation was a mute girl whose courage had saved not just lives but souls, proving that heroism came in many forms and that sometimes the smallest voices carried the most important messages. In her dreams that night, Clara saw the valley filled with children. Children who'd found safety and love after trauma. Children who'd learned that families could be built from choice as well as blood. Children who would grow up to pass on the lessons of courage and compassion they'd learned in this small frontier town. It was Ruby's vision made manifest, a legacy that would long outlive any of them. The mute girl's warning had saved a settlement, but her love had saved something far more precious, the souls of everyone she touched.